I don't know if anyone else has had an INDIS assessment in your laboratory where they have come in and they just pull files and they start looking at it and the protocols and procedures. And basically, if we were not following the guidelines to the letter, they were findings. And we had to do remediation. So you definitely would want to get an INDIS ruling on that.
When you ask them, they say, if you can prove with your internal validations, and that's what they said, that's why we put it in there, that your internal validation is what's going to support.
Yeah, because it always boils down. I mean, I kind of agree with Matt in that it's your internal validation, because I mean, that 200 picogram, I mean, first of all, with all the problems with quant out there right now, I mean, if they assessed your lab and you were putting in stuff, I mean, how do we even know that 200 picograms is actually 200 picograms? I mean, I think first of all, if they want to set a quantitation level, we have to start from the beginning and say, like, okay, well, we need to find a way to make sure that these quantitation levels are 100% accurate all the time. Or else how can you hold people accountable to a level of 200 picograms if you don't even know if it's 200 picograms, And so, I mean, if you start from there and then, and like this one especially, this is a short presentation, we're just going to go through a couple things, but like Matt was saying, there's a lot of things that we routinely change right now, like injection times and so forth, that they're saying now that you can't. Or if you do, you can't enter that into NDIS. But I mean, is there any labs that don't change injection? I mean, I don't know. I guess at FDLA I was there for 5 years, and you always had the other injection time you could bump it up to increase your peak heights. Well, it's okay. Well, some labs don't, but I guess a lot of labs do, and it's something that, if NDIS wanted to go through now and pull everything we've ever entered, then wow, it's going to empty out the database quite a bit. But yeah.
I do know, just as a follow-up, they are coming out with a write-up to explain this, I guess, definition that they tried to define. That clearly they didn't even hit close to the mark
No.
in defining something and throwing it out there. And so they are doing a very large write-up to try to really clear up, I think, the intent. Because at least one member that was part of writing that, I personally spoke to, and I said, is it your goal here to just have CODIS being functionless? Or, I mean, I don't know what we're doing.
Let's keep samples in the state database.
He definitely said that's not the case, and he said that certainly was not the intent of the individuals that were on that board that spoke to come up with this definition, so they are doing a follow-up.
Okay, because I mean, it's where do you make that data point, right? Because look at Quantiplot. We talked about that before, right? You guys all had that validated, but it was 2 to 3-fold less than what it was actually. So again, I think the important thing is to have a process in place where we make decisions, and those decisions are consistent. And that's, to me, is the key part of the internal validation, what that delivers. I think that the quant part, and then the question too is we do see differences in the utility of these type of applications, depending if you're using phenol chloroform, if you're using our chemistry, Prometheus chemistry, and such. So we see different performance changes too. So all those things need to get considered, and to I think your point earlier about getting written up or suggestions written there. I think the triaging point too is just to spend a little bit more time in the serology room and say where is this going? This is likely going to end up low template. So send it off here, and you know what? You might have MinElute be part of your SOP. You might there might be something else. That might be the way that tract sample goes, and it's kept separate from this tract sample. So that's something that we're trying to help our customers work through currently is how to handle that decision. Where does it happen? Does it happen even before it's extracted?
Just a quick side note, because we were spending some time on quantitation, because my laboratory went through a nightmare in the same process here to then finally realize standard A isn't even remotely close to the 200 nanograms per microliter. But we recently just had this with PowerPlex 16 kits, if anyone's using them. That 9947A is coming out as 10 nanograms per microliter. Just be very cautious if you're using any of that direct quant to make dilutions that you're then using as controls for your limit of detection, your stochastic thresholds, because it wasn't even remotely close. Like now we actually have to run that through a procedure as well when the new kits come in, because it was more like 3.5 nanograms per microliter based on the quantitation system that we have in place. It just all of a sudden we had no problem, went to a new lot number, and the next thing we're like barely above our stochastic threshold with the RFUs, and it's just completely put a halt to the whole process. And you know, you're calling and they're like, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm the only person, I swear, that's ever reported these things for every company I call. They're like, no, we've heard nothing every time. So I don't know if it's just the lab that I work in that we're just that unfortunate.
We've seen that issue too, just so that you know.
Oh, good. Well, that makes me feel a little better, because when I called, I was the only one
Same
again
here.
out there. So,
Yes,
We
because
have the
like
same problem.
when we were having our fluctuation about 1 nanogram before we figured out it was the quant, and we called AB and we were like, okay, so, you know, what's wrong with our instrument? Because, you know, and they said, oh no, the range, I mean, it was like from like 500 to 3,000 RFUs was their range. And I was like, that's a really big range. So that was a bit too big for us, and that's why we looked into the quantitation. Oh, so we're just gonna go through a couple of rules considering low-level samples and CODIS entry. Okay, so we're gonna cover low-level samples, what cannot be entered into the ENDIS system as of right now, how techniques such as MinElute post-PCR cleanup can be used to help develop investigative leads. So what is LCN? What effect does MinElute have on low copy number samples, and how can low copy number samples that undergo MinElute still be used to solve cases? Okay, so there's several definitions of LCN samples. LCN typing is typing of samples containing less than 100 picograms of DNA, and that was in that article, which I believe is the same article that Matt referenced earlier by Gill et al. The analysis of any results below the stochastic threshold for normal interpretation, and that was an article put out by Bruce Bedoli. And most recently, it was defined as typing any sample below 200 picograms. So there's been many definitions of what actually constitutes a low copy number sample. Still, others define LCN as increase in amplification cycles. So some people say as soon as you start increasing your amplification cycles, you're now performing low copy number analysis. And if the decision is to set a specific quantity for low copy number samples, then the question of how this quantity was achieved has to come up. Previously, we have seen that problems with the quantitation systems can make it difficult to get an accurate quantity reading. Therefore, one laboratory's 200 picograms may be another laboratory's 100 picograms. When auditing these laboratories to determine if they are in compliance, would the accuracy of the quantitation system be taken into account? So that to me would be one of the major requirements before we start giving somebody a finding for going below 200 picograms. There'll have to be a way of determining that they actually did have 200 picograms to start with. Applied Biosystems recommends 28 amplification cycles for their kits. Promega has a range from 28 to 32. Does this mean that if the cycles are increased in an Applied Biosystems kit from 20 to 32, we have now crossed over into low copy number typing? Also, if a laboratory typically uses 28 cycles with a Promega kit but increases cycles to 32 for low-level samples, are they now performing LCN analysis? I know some laboratories actually, it was in the same state, using the same kit, but one laboratory was using 28 cycles and one laboratory was using 30 cycles, and we were conducting a training there, and we were like, why is it that everybody from this laboratory gets so much better, gets higher RFU levels, and everybody at this laboratory is getting, and it's like, we provided the samples, so they're the same samples. So we're like, we were totally confused until the technically said, oh, well, we use 32. And it's like, oh, really? Oh, we use 28. And so the question is, if it's an increase in your cycle number, is that lab now performing LCN analysis while the other lab is not? But then again, Promega allows anywhere from 28 to 32. So according to Promega's protocols, it's not low copy number, but all these are questions I think need to be considered. And is it because Promega allows for a range, would the increase to 32 cycles not be considered low copy number testing because Promega says that it's part of their protocol? Also, as technology of instrumentation and amplification kit chemistry improve, analysts are able to detect full profiles at low and lower levels. Yet, with the quantity definition, this ability would not matter since the data may not be eligible for ENDIS. Promega just came out. They have a Promega 16 HS kit, which is supposed to give, we have actually one of our people here, Carrie Sutherland, one of our scientists here, she's actually doing a validation on that. And she's going to present it at, she's going to have information at a Promega. And basically, she's able to see that she's getting better DNA at lower and lower levels. The question becomes then, well, why are we even going to use this kit if it doesn't matter? It just seems like all these companies are coming out with kits to get us better data at lower and lower levels, and now we're being told that we really can't use this data to go into the ENDIS system. Basically, like we talked about before, the stochastic threshold must be looked at. This should be determined based on validations performed in the laboratory, so it'll be based on your individual validations. And this may differ from one amplification kit to the next, or even between instruments. So depending on what kit you're using in your laboratory, you may have different stochastic thresholds. So this is going to vary from one lab to the next, so it's be hard to really set a definite across-the-board definition. Accordingly, stochastic thresholds should be set by the individual laboratory. These validations can then be repeated as kit chemistries and/or instruments are improved. And that's another thing. The more we go, whether it be Applied Bioscience, whether it be Promega, whether it be QIAGEN, everybody's looking to improve because of the fact that touch DNA is getting more and more common a request at state laboratories or city or county laboratories now than they were before. So things are being improved to help us get full profiles from touch DNA. So all these validations that we perform will probably have to be repeated as we develop new technologies and institute newer kits that come out. As previously shown in results, MinElute post-PCR cleanup is able to improve the signal from DNA fragments by cleaning up excess primers and dyes. For low copy number samples, MinElute will simply raise the peak heights of low-level samples. MinElute will not correct any problems associated with the amplification of low-level DNA. Raising these peak heights may cause the stochastic threshold to rise. So basically, as I showed before, the thing about MinElute is if it's there before, it's there after. If it's not there before, it's not there after. So it's not fixing anything, it's simply raising the levels of everything you have there. Using MinElute on low-level samples will impact the definition of 200 picograms being the cutoff point for LCN. On testing I performed, a concentration of 125 picograms was targeted. At this level, I had data with RFUs well into the hundreds with no stochastic effects that affected the interpretation of data. And you'll see some of that when I give you all my earlier data because I have all the samples that you're going to work MinElute, we've already amplified and it's already been run on the instrument to set like a baseline level of what my peak heights were. And I had peak heights at 125 picograms that were 200 RFUs, sometimes 300 RFUs. Stuff that I wouldn't even want to use MinElute on because I'm going to put it into 3,000 RFUs now, But the fact is, I was getting full profiles. The only stochastic effects I had was like maybe some differences in peak height ratio, but I didn't get any dropout at 125 picograms. There were differences in peak height ratios. No allelic dropout or drop-in was observed. The profiles after the cleanup process could be easily interpreted. With tools such as MinElute, setting a specific quantity of DNA to identify samples as LCN would not be appropriate. When using MinElute, many factors can affect the increase in sample peak heights, the number of washes, the volume, etc. Like I told you all, that's something you all would have to set in your laboratory before you'll use this. When electing to use MinElute, a laboratory must rely on their validations to determine the correct threshold for the system. Ultimately, the threshold will be affected by the specifics of the protocol the laboratory decides to adopt based on what best fits their needs. Despite rulings of what is allowed into ENDIS, laboratories can still use the MinElute system to increase peak heights of low-level samples. On a state level, the CODIS administrator can allow the entry of LCN data to assist in searches at the state and local levels. And I do know some laboratories that are going to use MinElute, and they're basically, their attitude has become, well, we have a state database, and we're going to MinElute our low-level samples. We're going to get full profiles. We'll just keep them at the state level, and we'll solve all crimes at the state level. One concern is if ENDIS won't allow this data to be entered, could a defense attorney successfully argue the court should not consider the data? And that is it's something where your validations are really going to have to come into play here, because it is something to think to the back of your head. If a defense attorney finds out that your data, whereas it's good data and everything like that, but that ENDIS is not going to accept it because the level it's at, could a defense attorney argue, therefore, that the court should not accept your data? Because, if the database doesn't want to take your data, then, obviously the court shouldn't. So that's where your validations, I think, are really going to have to come into play, and you're going to have to perform really good validations to show that this is good data that I'm producing. Oh, that was it. Okay, sorry, that was a short one.